To delve more on what impact these sanctions on senior Harare officers are likely to have, we're now joined in studio by Zimbabwean journalist Hopeful Chingono and former local government, rural development and housing minister Saviour Kasukuwere. Gentlemen, a very good evening. Thanks so much for coming onto Africa Today.
Thank you very much.
Hopeful, I'm going to start off with you now. As an investigative journalist, and you've reported extensively on corruption and human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, what is your reaction to the imposition of new sanctions on President Mnangagwa and other senior government officials?
I was happy that the old sanctions regime was removed because it also entangled other companies that were linked to the state, and it gave cover to the government to explain its failures and corrupt rule. The new set of sanctions are now permanent. The previous ones were based on an emergency executive order by the President of the United States of America at that time, George Bush. What we have in Zimbabwe is a very corrupt environment where hospitals don't work anymore because of corruption. They're dilapidated. As I've always said in the past, that 2,500 Zimbabwean women die every year giving birth, and 95% of women who are giving birth at Musina Hospital on the South African side are from Zimbabwe because we have a collapsed health delivery system. The biggest hospital in Zimbabwe only has one maternity theatre, which was built in 1977 by Ian Smith. So it's quite evident that all the problems that we're facing today in Zimbabwe have not been caused by sanctions, but by corrupt rule, because Zimbabwe's got a lot of resources. $150 million US worth of gold is smuggled every month out of Zimbabwe. Those are billions at the end of every 12 months. So the imposition of the current sanctions and focusing on corruption, I hope they will tweak the conscience of the ruling elites in Zimbabwe to focus on doing what is good for the country so that people do not go to bed on empty stomachs and hospitals are working.
Mr. Kasukuwere, when sanctions were implemented, you were a member of parliament, obviously a part of that government, and critics have argued that you were complicit in what led to these sanctions. How do you respond to these accusations? And obviously, you were one of those people that was on the sanctions list, and you must be delighted that you're not there anymore.
Well, I think it's a huge relief. Obviously, there is a history to how the sanctions were imposed, which was obviously to do with the land question that was happening at that point in time. You know how the British government, then Blair, worked with the American administration to bring about this set of rules. If you read through the Sidera Act, for instance, it speaks clearly to the questions of land reform, obviously questions of democracy, human rights abuses, and so forth. But the crux of the matter then was the land question that was being handled.
But the other issue, obviously, is that of corruption. And corruption has gone unabated from the time that you were in office till this very day.
Well, obviously, when some of us were removed from the office, we were called criminals around the president. But we have cleared ourselves. We have brought ourselves before the courts. That has been cleared. But corruption, yes, indeed, is pervasive in our society, in our country, and it must be fought.
So, well, let's understand what these sanctions mean for the people of Zimbabwe, because that list was some 70 people who were on sanctions. It's been cut down to 11, which is a huge number. But what is it doing for the people of Zimbabwe? Should the people of Zimbabwe be breathing a sigh of relief?
I think from what we've experienced in the past 23 years, personally, I've been on the record and I've written extensively on the view that sanctions actually don't work. What they've done, they've given cover to the ruling elites in Zimbabwe to make sure that they've got something they can use as an excuse to explain corrupt rule, to explain their failures, the policies that have failed to deliver for the people of Zimbabwe. If you look at the new set of sanctions that are there, the people that are being hit by those sanctions are, extremely wealthy. Most of them are billionaires. They won't feel the pain that ordinary people feel from their bad governance. What they will do is it will make it a little bit more difficult for them to transact. For instance, President Mnangagwa and anyone who's on the list, the 11 of them, will not be able to open a bank account in any other country except Zimbabwe, because any bank does business with the United States of America, because the clearing is done in New York. So they make sure that whoever is opening a bank account is not sanctioned anywhere in the world. They are afraid of being penalized. I think on a broader note, the problem that we're going to face is the embarrassment of having a head of state, his deputy, the first lady of the country, and defense minister of the country who are sanctioned. And this time, the specific issue is corruption and abuse of human rights. So it will make it difficult for investors, for instance, to want to go to a country where the head of state has been sanctioned for corruption.
Well, I don't think it bothers President Mnangagwa or their regime of Zimbabwe. In fact, Mr. Kasukuwere, you were on sanctions. How difficult was it for you to live your life because you were on sanctions?
Opal says they are not effective. No. Sanctions are actually very painful.
So let's not talk about the people of Zimbabwe, because, I mean, that's pretty clear. What about you as
that's what I'm saying. I've often joked with Hopewell that if he gives me $50 at the airport and say, go and change this money, just at the Bureau de Change, if they look at my passport, they'll say, sorry, sir, I've not had a bank account for the past 23 years. Not even in Zimbabwe, because all the Zimbabwean banks must also set up corresponding lines of credit, and they also work with all the banks, especially the USA, for their clearance. Now, the moment they are seen or are working with somebody who's an SDN, especially designated national, they will be also in trouble. You remember there was a bill of over 400 million that was placed on CBZ. And many other banks, Standard Bank, actually has had to pull out of Zimbabwe because it became very untenable. One client or the other were also involved or were part of their banking community. They would bring that contagion on the banks. So it's not a walk in the park.
But Mr. Kasukuwere, you're a powerful man, and you've obviously flourished. I mean, Hopewell, you've reported on the lavish lifestyle that you led in Zimbabwe, the palatial mansion that you built. Much of that doesn't speak to an individual who's caused any measure of discomfort because of sanctions.
Well, I think you want also to look at the background. I'm a businessman. I didn't go into politics just from the street. I went into politics having built myself in business. But we're talking here about the pain and the impact of sanctions broadly in terms of access for most of the banks, which in turn support industry and commerce. I believe where we are now, we have overcome this huge hump. It is now time for us to focus on how we can get the economy again to work for the people of Zimbabwe. And the other measures that have been taken, I think Hopewell has explained clearly what it means. These are targeted sanctions now that are looking at issues of abuse and human rights as well as corruption. But the broad sanctions that had been brought about by the Bush administration under the Zidera, behind the Zidera, those emergence powers, have gone. And I think this is a huge relief to industry. It's a huge relief to the people of Zimbabwe. Even the communications coming from the United States government officials is very clear. But from now onwards, I'm sure their banking sector, their business executives will find it necessary. But remember, the USA also has to do business with Africa. It can't allow for that economic space to be occupied by other countries. So it's a calculated move by the states itself also to get back into business. They need some resources in Africa, they need some resources in Zimbabwe, and it's in their interest also to work with Zimbabwe. I don't think it was a sustainable policy to go beyond the 23 years or so, punishing almost broadly everybody. And this decision, I think it's a welcome decision that should really usher in a new era in terms of economic growth, in terms of the relations between our country and the states. I also want to underline, the rest must be handled diplomatically. I've seen the statements that have been made by Zimbabwe and so forth. They should learn to be diplomats. Certain things don't need you to be shouting. Insults don't help anything. Explain your case. If you've been accused of corruption, say, here I stand. These are my assets. Where do you think the corruption is? Dr. Mandaza was spot on this morning when he said, If the accusations have been made, we want the states to favor us with the details of what they allege to be corruption. And because many Zimbabweans have been talking about the corruption in the country, it's also in the interest of the leadership to clean their image and for them to be able to say, look, these are the allegations against us, but this is not what we are. We are a transparent government. We want our country to move forward. They should not be an albatross on the neck of the whole economy.
Well, issue around image and cleaning up their act is not something that's high on the agenda of the Zimbabwean government. But do you get the sense that the people of Zimbabwe have been sacrificed to some degree by the lifting of parts of these sanctions? Because for 23 years or so, these sanctions have stood with almost no benefit or no amount of success as to why they were implemented, and part of them have been lifted now. And have the people suffered for nothing in those 23 years?
I think the people of Zimbabwe suffered, I think, mostly from bad governance, from corruption, abuse of human rights, abuse of state institutions. You will remember that I was thrown into prison 3 times inside 6 months in 2020 and 2021 for reporting and exposing corruption by very prominent ZANU-PF elites in Zimbabwe. So corruption has been the bedrock and continues to be the bedrock of the problems that Zimbabwe faces today. So with or without sanctions, it makes no difference. That's why I've always argued that sanctions are a cosmetic tool used by the United States of America. They have to be seen to be doing something. But the government in Zimbabwe does not care, as you correctly said, that the people that have been sanctioned, when they were sanctioned in 2002, they are probably 100 times wealthier than they were in 2002 when they were first sanctioned. So they continue to make money on the back of corruption. They continue to make money on the back of plunder of Zimbabwe's natural resources, as we saw in many documentary films that have been broadcast by international broadcasters. Gold is smuggled out of Zimbabwe, diamonds are smuggled out of Zimbabwe. The former president went on the record and said that 15 billion US dollars worth of diamonds were smuggled out. But the tragedy is that the people who are suffering and bearing the brunt of that corruption is the ordinary person in the streets. The Zimbabwean government has failed to create an environment which is conducive for investment. 95% of Zimbabwe's potential job workforce is out of work. You look around and we have the highest inflation in the world. We have the highest food inflation in the world. 95% has been lost on the local currency has lost 95% of its buying power. So nothing is working in Zimbabwe. And if you look, as Mr. Kasukuwere said, if you read the response of the Zimbabwean government, it doesn't show a government that is serious or wants to engage with the United States of America. They really don't care, and I don't think anything is going to change in Zimbabwe. As long as the present government is in power, they don't care.
Well, I don't think it's just about the present government, Mr. Kasukuwere. It's also about the government that you served. Where is the empathy in government? I mean,
let's deal with the current situation. The history will take us a whole day to discuss.
Well, the reason I ask is because there's a common thread, right?
Well,
and that
indeed.
common thread is around Zimbabwean people, right, that have been suffering for years. So whether it was the old government or the current government, the issues are essentially the same.
Well, I think we have to learn from our mistakes. We have to learn from those things that were done in the past. But critically, the question of fighting corruption comes to mind. This is what we must now deal with. There has been this twin evil, sanctions and corruption. Anybody who wanted to steal will use sanctions as an excuse. It became a scapegoat. And I think I agree with Hopewell to an extent with regards to how sanctions became a gateway for people to make money. And every other activity that was done, every transaction, there was a premium because we are trying to cover our back because of sanctions. So sanctions gave an opportunity for people to plunder the national economy. And this opportunity that has now come through, the relief that I've talked about, should allow our correct institutions to manage our minerals Marketing Corporation. So all those dark alleys must be closed. We have the Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation, let it do its work. The Zimbabwe Defense Industries, if it has to procure assets for the defense forces, there has to be that transparency that is required, which makes it also easier for citizens to have faith in their government. It's essential that the social contract, the social compact between the people and government is restored.
You're watching Africa Today, and we're still in conversation with Saviour Kasukuwere and Hopeful Chingono. We are talking sanctions in Zimbabwe. Hopeful, I want to come to you now, just based on what Mr. Kasukuwere said, and let's talk a little bit about the political will, right? Firstly, to deal with the issues of corruption. Firstly, do you think there is political will? There is a desire to deal with those issues around corruption? And secondly, Mr. Kasukuwere raised the issue of the United States government, and you being a journalist are obviously very au fait with this, are not giving us the detail that the people would like to know. They're not taking us into their confidence. They're talking about vast amounts of corruption. They're coming up with bills and laws around a corrupt government, but where's the paper trail? Where's that information? How important is that information?
Well, I guess for the average Zimbabwean, they don't need to ask that question, and they won't be asking it because they live around corruption every day. They see the things that are happening to their country. Roads are potholed. Zimbabweans don't have clean drinking water in urban areas across the whole country. Schools do not have books. Hospitals do not have medication. So that's the evidence of corruption that's taking place. The government will come out and say that it has made X amount of billions from mineral resources. Where is that money going? It's going to corruption. So when you look at the reality of corruption and the political will, your first question, there's no political will at all to deal with corruption, because corruption is taking place in a space which is controlled by the political actors who are supposed to be running a clean government. They are the main actors in corrupt rule, so they have no desire to do so. You see, the problem is that it starts with how a government is elected. When a government rigs elections, when you have got a shambolic election, that's a corrupt entrance into governance. So such a government has no desire to do anything else because it came into power through corruption. If you look at the last election in August 2023, ballot papers were not brought to polling stations for the whole day. That is corrupt behavior. And so there's no political will to deal with corruption because it's a government that came into power through corruption. And then the second thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, and most of your viewers will be aware of this, I went to prison 3 times. Why would a government that jails journalists for exposing corruption have any political will to fight corruption? They simply won't be any political will because it's a corrupt government. It needs to change if things are going to change in Zimbabwe. But unfortunately, as I've always said, I don't see the current crop of political elites in ZANU-PF who are running the country deciding to change, because things have progressively gotten worse from 2017 when the military coup, which kicked out people like Mr. Kasukuwere out of government. They were called criminals around the president, but it turns out that the real criminals are the ones that were executing the coup, because even the president has accepted that the government is corrupt. But the main question should be, why then are you not dealing with the corruption if you accept that it is there?
That's a question for you, Mr. Kasukuwere, because we've seen, I mean, if you look at the South African environment, whilst, I don't know if it's comparing apples with apples, but there's a huge amount of corruption. It is evident. I mean, there's a Zondo Commission that documented all the levels of corruption, and nothing's happened. So let's go to Zimbabwe and look at corruption in that country. Now, you are now sitting on the opposition fence. How do you envision curtailing the levels of corruption in Zimbabwe?
The key corrupt actors are known in Zimbabwe, and we know exactly how they thrive.
Who are they and how do they thrive?
Well, obviously, you get them in the mining sector. You have them, especially in the mining sector. There's a lot of thievery going on. Financial service sector. These are the areas that has caused so much pain to the generality of our people as well as the economy. What's missing is a determined crackdown on those who have abused the resources that belong to the people, those who on a daily basis are siphoning billions of dollars out of the country. They are known. And now, unfortunately, because the entire system is scared to deal with the big guns, you now have a situation where the international community, somewhere else, somebody decides to say, look, I think the following people must be investigated, unfortunately. Now, in South Africa, the difference is that the Zondo Commission will call everybody to account. Whether they get prosecuted or not is something else. But there's a determination to say, we are determined to fight corruption. Now, in Zimbabwe, you can't have a Zondo Commission. It won't work. Because the Zondo in Zimbabwe will have to be, either himself is corrupt, okay? And he can't even preside over a corruption meeting to decide who's being corrupt because he himself is corrupt. This is the difference with Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now, going further, my view is that we thought some of the appointments in National Prosecution Authority and so forth were going to change and see those who are corrupt being nailed. But you then find a situation where the state spends a huge amount of resources nailing a person like Job Sikala. Yet there are people who have harvested where they should never have harvested state resources, but they're walking scot-free. You have those cases of the young man from Gokwe, what's his name? The MP. Where did the case go? Just disappeared under the radar. Nothing is talked about. And so the crackdown is selective. It's also political. They will target you because they don't agree with you politically. Now, this is unfair, and this is sad. And these are the things now that are bringing so much interference into Zimbabwe because as citizens and as a leadership, we are failing to do what is correct. That is to talk to our people, to unite our nation, and if you're going to crack down on corruption, just do it across the board. Let it be fair, not to determine before even somebody goes to court what he must pay for. How do you keep somebody for 600 days in prison and say, after all that paid, he's acquitted?
Well, I'm sure you have a bone to chew with the judiciary in Zimbabwe, hopefully. I mean, you spent a huge amount of time in prison for no reason.
Really. Case.
But let's talk about the role of journalists and civil society and advocate. I mean, you've exposed numerous cases of corruption, but all to no avail. Do you still feel you have a role to play?
I think as journalists in Zimbabwe and civil society organizations like Transparency International, we have a role to play. We have to continue playing our role as the media, exposing, shining our light in dark corners where corruption is taking place. The problem we have, as Saviour Kasukuwere alluded, is the judiciary. Cases will go and they will collapse. The police service is corrupt, the prosecution service is corrupt, the judiciary is captured by political elites, is corrupt. So that is the main problem. You cannot take a case to the Zimbabwean judiciary of corruption involving a powerful person and expect to get prosecution. If you get prosecution, don't expect to get a conviction. A lot of the big guns that have been involved in looting millions of dollars have been taken to court. Some have declared insanity, and after a couple of months or 2-3 years, they are back in Parliament, and yet they declared insanity. They presided over the looting of over $100 million for pensioners. Pensioners in Zimbabwe are dying in abject poverty. They don't even have access to basic medical care like getting paracetamol because of that kind of corruption. But the courts have let them down. But as journalists, we should not stop because we have a corrupt court system or judiciary system. Zimbabwe is 149 out of 180 in terms of the corruption index, global corruption index. 180 is the West. Zimbabwe is on 149. So it tells you how bad the situation is. But we have to keep doing our work. The problem that we face as journalists is that the economy has collapsed. So you find that the brown envelopes are also coming to the newsrooms, corruption is coming into the newsrooms, and certain stories that are supposed to be published, they are not being published because journalists, they earn peanuts and they're given money by political elites.
And they want to survive.
Yes.
Mr. Kasukuwere, as we wrap up, you're a father. Now, what does a father say to his children growing up in Zimbabwe when the child says, what does the future hold for me? I mean, how do you keep, we keep talking about brain drain, right? But how do you just keep the moral fiber of young people in a country? I mean, you're talking about professionals, about journalists that are receiving the brown envelope. What's the sort of conversation you have with your son or daughter?
It's sad. I think the young people in our country have lost. Their hope has gone. As a father, my last son, is about 23 years now. He has never worked. After university, he said to come and work with me in business. And you feel that what I went through when I was young, given a chance to work, made me earn and learn quite a lot about things that must be done. I learned how to relate with other people. I also started earning my own pension, and that is no longer available. But worse still is the drug and substance abuse that is now caught up in our society. Most of our young people are drunk on a daily basis, are taking drugs on a daily basis, and it appears somebody has just opened this whole chute of drugs into the country. Almost each and every family is battling with the question of drugs. And this is shattering the hopes and aspirations of our young people. And it's also a result of a collapsed economy. We no longer have an economy that absorbs our young people. As they leave universities, are they going to nursing? Are they going to teaching? Most of them have left the country. And when they leave the country, they are working in countries and at some point, in some cases, way below their station in terms of education. And they are going through so much pain, which should really not be happening. So we need to reorganize our country. There's no doubt about it. All the issues that we have raised and Opal has raised, the question of health and so forth, these all feed into this whole challenge that is now coming to dawn on all of us, that our young people have lost out, their hopes have been dashed. In fact, the older people are living ahead of their time. Now they are living into the future of our children. Our grandchildren have no future. We need to stop this bleeding. We need to bring back Zimbabwe, rebuild our country. The moral fiber has to come back. The families have to come back. Parents are leaving their children with their go-go's and so forth to go and look for money in the States. What does it mean? It means that that family become divided, and the kids are now going out in the streets. Some of them are taking drugs, some of them are getting substances, and some of them are getting pregnant at a very early age.
Would have liked to have carried on the conversation, but we've run short of time. Former local government, rural development and housing minister Saviour Kasukuwere, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. Hopo Chingono, world-class, award-winning journalist. Thank you for speaking to us on Africa Today.